My name is Margaret Whitmore, and for 40 years, I was the woman who built and ran the company everyone in this city respected. When people talked about Whitmore Industries, they didn't just see buildings, offices, and thousands of employees. They saw my life's work. I started this business when I was 28 years old with a small loan, a rented office, and a dream bigger than the city skyline. Back then people said a woman could never survive in the business world, especially not in manufacturing and logistics, but I proved them wrong year after year. I worked late nights, missed holidays, and sometimes even slept on the office couch, just to make sure every deal, every contract, and every employee was taken care of. Slowly the company grew from a tiny startup into a powerful corporation. By the time I turned 68, Whitmore Industries had offices in 5 states and hundreds of workers who depended on it. But on one cold Monday morning, everything I believed about loyalty, family, and leadership was about to change. That morning I walked into the boardroom like I had done thousands of times before. The large glass windows overlooked the city, and the long polished table reflected the faces of the people sitting around it. Among them was my own son, Daniel Whitmore, the man I had once dreamed would carry my legacy forward. Next to him sat his wife Lisa, who had recently joined the company's strategy department. At the head of the table sat Robert Kane, the chairman of the board. Something about the silence in the room felt strange, heavier than usual, like everyone was waiting for a storm to begin. I sat down calmly and opened my notebook. "Good morning," I said. But no one answered right away. Robert cleared his throat and looked around the table before speaking. "Margaret," he began slowly, "this meeting is about the future leadership of the company." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Then Daniel finally looked up at me, and the words that came out of his mouth felt like a knife sliding into my chest. "Mom, the board believes you're too old to continue to run the company." For a moment the entire room felt frozen. The woman who built the empire was now being told she didn't belong in it anymore. Robert quickly added, "Please don't take this personally, Margaret. The business world is changing quickly, and we believe the company needs younger leadership to move forward." Lisa nodded in agreement, as if this decision had been carefully prepared long before I even walked into that room. I looked from one face to another, noticing how none of them seemed surprised. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a plan. A plan they had probably discussed many times, without inviting the founder of the company herself. Daniel leaned forward and said gently, "Mom, we just think it's time for you to step back. You've done enough. You should retire and enjoy life. Enjoy life." The words sounded kind, but behind them was a message that cut deeper than anything else they had said. The message was simple. Margaret Whitmore was no longer needed. I slowly closed my notebook and folded my hands together on the table. I had spent decades negotiating with powerful executives, investors, and politicians, so hiding emotion was something I had mastered long ago. Inside, however, something was changing. Something quiet and powerful. "So," I said calmly, "you believe I'm too old to continue to run the company I built?" No one answered immediately. That silence told me everything. Finally Robert nodded. "Yes. That's the board's position." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the city I had helped grow through thousands of contracts and partnerships. My name was on the company building. My decisions had shaped the lives of thousands of employees. And now the very people benefiting from my work believed the founder herself had become a problem. I could have argued. I could have reminded them who built Whitmore Industries from nothing. But instead I simply smiled politely and stood up from my chair. "Thank you for sharing your thoughts," I said. The board members looked confused, probably expecting anger, or a long speech defending my position. But I gave them neither. Sometimes silence is more powerful than shouting. As I walked toward the door, Daniel spoke again. "Mom, we just want what's best for the company." I paused for a second, then nodded slowly. "Of course you do," I replied before leaving the room. What none of them realized at that moment was that the woman they had just dismissed as too old still owned more than half of the company shares. In other words, the woman they thought they had removed from power still controlled the fate of the entire business. And by the next morning, their world was about to change in a way none of them could imagine. But before the story continues, if you enjoy powerful stories about business, justice, and unexpected twists like this one, take a second to hit the subscribe button, like the video, and share this story. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from, because it's always amazing to see how stories like this connect people from different parts of the world. Trust me, what happens the next morning will prove that underestimating a determined woman can be the biggest mistake anyone can make. When I left the boardroom that morning, I walked slowly down the long hallway of Whitmore Industries. Every step echoed softly against the marble floor, and every picture on the wall reminded me of a different year of my life. There were photographs of the first office we opened, the first factory we built, and the first group of employees who believed in my dream. I had spent decades building this place. For 40 years, I woke up every morning with one goal, to run the company better than the day before. Yet just minutes earlier, the people sitting in that boardroom looked at me and calmly said I was too old to continue leading the business I had created. I entered my office and gently closed the door behind me. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. The large desk, the shelves filled with awards, and the framed newspaper headlines all told the story of a woman who had built an empire from nothing. But now, according to the board, that woman was no longer needed. I sat down in my chair and stared at the city skyline outside the window. For a moment, I replayed the meeting in my mind. The words were still clear. "You're too old to run the company, comma. It was strange how calmly they said it, as if they were simply discussing the weather. Robert Kane had tried to sound respectful, but the meaning behind his words was obvious. They believed experience had become a weakness instead of a strength. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," I said. Emily Carter, my assistant of 15 years, stepped inside. Emily was one of the few people in the company who had been there long enough to remember the early days when our office had only 5 employees and a coffee machine that barely worked. She looked at me carefully, as if trying to read my expression. "I heard about the meeting," she said quietly. I smiled slightly. "News travels fast in this building." Emily shook her head. "I can't believe they said you were too old to run the company, comma. Everyone knows this business exists because of you." I appreciated her loyalty, but I also knew the truth about power in the corporate world. Loyalty often disappears the moment people believe the leader is losing control. I stood up and walked toward the window again. Down below, hundreds of employees were entering the building, unaware that something major had just happened at the top level of the company. "Emily," I said calmly, "do you remember the first day you started working here?" She nodded. "You interviewed me yourself." "And what did I tell you during that interview?" I asked. She smiled slightly as she remembered. "You said this company would always reward people who think ahead." I nodded slowly. Thinking ahead had been the secret behind every success Whitmore Industries ever achieved. I turned around and looked directly at her. "Well, today I'm going to do exactly that." Emily raised her eyebrows. "What do you mean?" I walked back to my desk and opened a locked drawer. Inside were several documents. Documents most of the board members had probably forgotten about over the years. These papers proved something very important. I still owned the majority of the company shares. In simple terms, the woman they said was too old to run the company, still controlled the company itself. Emily watched as I placed the documents carefully on the desk. They think the story ends with that meeting, I said quietly. But the story hasn't even started yet. She looked at the papers, then back at me. Margaret, what are you planning? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked once more at the photographs on the wall, the memories of decades of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. No one in that boardroom understood the level of dedication it took to build something like this. And perhaps that was the problem. They had inherited success, without ever experiencing the struggle that created it. Finally, I spoke. They believe I'm too old to make decisions for this company, I said calmly. So tomorrow morning, I'm going to make the biggest decision Whitmore Industries has ever seen. Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She had learned long ago that when I spoke in that calm tone, something important was about to happen. I picked up the phone and looked at her. Please contact James Holloway and ask if he's available for a meeting early tomorrow. Emily blinked in surprise. James Holloway was one of the most powerful investors in the country. If he was involved, something very big was coming. Tomorrow morning, she asked. I nodded. Yes. The next morning, ... Emily slowly understood that this was not just another business decision. This was the beginning of a move that could change everything, including the future of the board members, who had just declared their founder too old to run the company, . She left the office to make the call, and I sat quietly in my chair once again. Outside the window, the city lights were beginning to appear as evening approached. Somewhere upstairs in the boardroom, the people who had just challenged my leadership were probably celebrating their victory. But sometimes the biggest mistake in business is believing the game is over before the final move is made. And by the next morning, they were about to learn exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate a woman who built the very company they tried to take away from her. That evening the entire building slowly became quiet as employees finished their work and headed home. The lights in many offices turned off one by one, but the light in my office remained on. I sat behind my desk, reviewing the documents spread neatly across the table. Contracts, ownership records, and share certificates that told the real story of Whitmore Industries. Earlier that day the board members had looked at me with polite smiles and told me I was too old, . According to them, someone younger should run the company, . The strange thing was that none of them seemed to remember who still owned most of the company. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the city outside the window. 40 years ago that skyline looked very different. Back then there were fewer buildings and fewer opportunities. But I believed in something bigger than the present moment. I believed that with hard work, courage, and patience, a person could build something that lasted for generations. That belief was how Whitmore Industries was born. When I started the company, people often laughed at me. They said a young woman could never succeed in a competitive industry dominated by powerful businessmen. But every contract I signed and every deal I negotiated proved them wrong. Slowly the company grew stronger. Factories opened. Offices expanded. Employees joined. Eventually the same people who doubted me began to respect the business I had built. But success can sometimes make people forget the past. Over the years many of the board members joined the company long after the difficult early days were over. They inherited a successful organization without seeing the struggle that created it. That was probably why they believed the founder had become unnecessary. I looked again at the documents in front of me. These papers confirmed something very important. Even if the board believed I was too old to run the company, the final decision about the company's future still belonged to me. There was another knock on the door. Emily stepped inside carrying a small notebook. I spoke with James Holloway, she said. He agreed to meet tomorrow. I nodded calmly. Good. She hesitated for a moment. Margaret, are you sure about this? I smiled slightly. Emily had worked beside me long enough to recognize when a major decision was approaching. Do you remember what the board said today? I asked. She sighed. Yes. They said you were too old to run the company, I stood up and walked toward the window again. The city lights shimmered across the glass towers, and traffic moved like glowing lines across the streets below. Somewhere inside this city were thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on Whitmore Industries. The board believes age means weakness, I said quietly. But experience teaches you something very important. Emily tilted her head slightly. What's that? Timing, I answered. In business, timing is everything. Knowing when to act can be more powerful than knowing how to act. For decades, I had made decisions that shaped the future of Whitmore Industries. Today would be no different. I returned to my desk and carefully organized the documents into a folder. Inside were the ownership agreements that gave me majority control of the company. Without those documents, the board might have been able to force me into retirement. But with them, the story was completely different. Emily watched quietly as I prepared everything. So tomorrow you'll meet James Holloway, she said. Yes. And after that? I paused for a moment. Then I spoke slowly so that every word carried meaning. After that, I may decide to sell it, Emily's eyes widened slightly. You mean? Sell it, the entire company? I nodded calmly. Yes. For a moment she said nothing. Selling Whitmore Industries would be one of the biggest business transactions in the region. It would change the lives of everyone connected to the company, including the board members who believed they had already taken control. But what about the board? Emily asked carefully. I gave a small smile. The board believes the founder has no power left. And they are wrong. Very wrong. I closed the folder and placed it neatly on the desk. Tomorrow would be the next morning, and that morning would bring a surprise none of them expected. Emily looked thoughtful. They really underestimated you. That happens more often than people realize, I said gently. Underestimation can be a dangerous mistake. When people believe someone is finished, they stop paying attention. And when they stop paying attention, they fail to see the move that changes everything. I glanced once more around my office. Every award on the shelf, every photograph on the wall, and every framed newspaper article represented decades of effort. Selling the company would not erase those memories. Instead, it would prove something important. That leadership is not defined by age, but by the ability to make bold decisions when necessary. Emily walked toward the door, but stopped before leaving. Margaret, she said, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad I've had the chance to work with you. I smiled warmly. Thank you, Emily. When she left, the office returned to silence. I switched off the desk lamp and stood for a moment in the dim light of the city outside. Earlier that day the board members believed they had won. They believed the story ended with their announcement that I was too old to run the company, But the truth was much more interesting than they realized. Because by the dot next morning, I would make a decision that would shock every one of them. And if that decision required me to sell it, then so be it. After all, the founder of Whitmore Industries was still the one writing the final chapter of this story. The sun had barely risen when I arrived at the office the dot next morning, The city streets were still quiet, and the building lobby felt unusually calm. Normally, I arrived later in the morning after most of the executives had already started their day, but today was different. Today I wanted to be the first one inside the building that carried my name for 4 decades. I walked slowly through the entrance hall, noticing the large company logo shining proudly on the wall. Whitmore Industries. The company I had created, protected, and guided for 40 years. Yet yesterday, the board had confidently told me I was too old to run the company, I entered my office and placed the folder of documents neatly on the desk. Inside that folder were the papers that would change everything before the day was over. Emily arrived shortly after with 2 cups of coffee and a calm, but curious expression. She had barely slept the night before, and honestly, neither had I. Major decisions rarely allow for peaceful sleep. James Holloway confirmed he's on his way, she said quietly. I nodded and took a slow sip of coffee. Good. Today will be a very interesting day. At exactly 9 o'clock, James Holloway walked into my office. He was a tall, confident man known throughout the business world as someone who could transform companies overnight. Investors respected him, competitors feared him, and executives watched every move he made. When he shook my hand, he smiled politely. Margaret Whitmore, he said. It's an honor to finally meet you. The honor is mine, I replied. Please, have a seat. Within minutes we began discussing the details of Whitmore Industries. James already knew the company very well. In fact, he had once tried to buy a portion of the business years ago, but at that time I had declined the offer. Back then I still wanted to personally run the company, and guide its future myself. But circumstances had changed. Yesterday, the board had made their position clear. They believed the founder was now too old, After reviewing several documents, James leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. Margaret, he said slowly, this company is extremely valuable. Are you certain you want to sell it, I smiled calmly. Yes. I'm certain. He studied my face for a moment, as if trying to understand the deeper story behind the decision. Business leaders often sell companies for profit, but this decision carried more meaning than simple numbers. You know, he continued, most founders never let go of something they built. That's true, I said. But sometimes letting go is the smartest move a leader can make. The negotiation itself didn't take long. James was experienced, and I was prepared. Within an hour the final documents were ready. I picked up the pen, signed the last page, and placed the paper back on the desk. In that moment, Whitmore Industries officially had a new owner. I had decided to sell it, James stood up and shook my hand again. This will be one of the biggest acquisitions of the year, he said. I nodded. Take good care of the company. I will, he replied. And I assure you, the leadership structure will change quickly. That last sentence was exactly what I expected. An hour later, the board members gathered once again in the boardroom. They believed the meeting was about discussing the leadership transition they had planned after declaring I was too old to run the company, Daniel, my son, sat confidently beside Robert Kane. Lisa flipped through her tablet, as if preparing for another routine business discussion. When I entered the room, they all looked up. Robert smiled politely. Margaret, thank you for coming. We were just about to discuss the transition plan. I placed the folder on the table. Yes, I said calmly. About that. The room grew quiet. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Mom, we know yesterday's conversation was difficult, but we believe this change is necessary for the future of the company. I opened the folder and slid several documents across the table. I understand, I replied. Which is why I made a decision early this next morning, . Robert picked up the papers and began reading. Within seconds his confident expression disappeared. Lisa leaned closer to look at the document, and Daniel stood up from his chair in shock. You sold it, . Daniel asked. I nodded calmly. Yes, I said. Since you all believed I was too old to run the company, I decided it was time to let someone else take control completely. The silence in the room was almost unbelievable. Just yesterday, they had believed they were removing the founder from leadership. Now they realized something far more serious had happened. Robert looked pale. Margaret, the company has a new owner. Yes, I replied. James Holloway. Lisa's eyes widened. Everyone in the business world knew that name. Daniel stared at the papers in disbelief. You did this without consulting the board. I met his gaze calmly. As majority owner, I said gently, that decision was mine to make. The boardroom fell completely silent. They had believed they were powerful enough to decide the founder's future. They had believed the story ended when they declared I was too old, . But the real ending had just begun. The boardroom remained completely silent after I explained what had happened earlier that next morning, . The documents were still spread across the table, and every board member stared at them as if hoping the words would suddenly disappear. But the truth was clear and impossible to change. Whitmore Industries no longer belonged to them, and it no longer belonged to me either. I had decided to sell it, . Daniel was the first to speak. My son looked at the papers again, then at me, his face full of disbelief. Mom, you actually sold it, . He asked slowly. Yes, I answered calmly. I did. Lisa leaned back in her chair, clearly shocked. Robert Kane, the chairman of the board, looked like a man who had just realized he misunderstood the entire situation. Only yesterday, they had sat around this same table and told me I was too old, . They believed I should step aside so someone younger could run the company, . In their minds, the decision had already been made. But they had forgotten something very important. The person they were trying to remove was still the founder and majority owner. Daniel shook his head as if trying to process everything. You should have talked to us first, he said. I looked at him calmly. Yesterday, you already made it clear that my opinion was no longer important. You said I was too old to run the company, . So I simply made a decision about what to do next. No one spoke for a moment. The room felt different now. The same people who had been confident and powerful the day before now looked uncertain and worried. They understood that the situation had changed completely. Robert slowly placed the documents back on the table. James Holloway now owns Whitmore Industries, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. And he will decide what happens to the board. That is correct. Lisa glanced nervously at Daniel. Everyone in the business world knew that James Holloway rarely kept the same leadership team when he acquired a company. He preferred to restructure everything quickly. In other words, the people who believed they would soon control the company might not even have positions in it anymore. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I didn't think you would go this far. I gave a small smile. Neither did you think I would still have the power to change everything. For decades, I had led Whitmore Industries through difficult challenges. Competitors tried to destroy us, economic crises threatened our growth, and many people doubted our success. But every time we faced a challenge, the solution was always the same: think clearly, act wisely, and never underestimate the power of experience. I stood up slowly and looked around the boardroom. The large table, the tall windows, and the city view were all familiar to me. I had spent countless hours in this room making decisions that shaped the future of the company. You know, I said gently, when I started this business, people told me something similar. The board members listened quietly. They said a woman couldn't succeed in this industry. They said the business world was too difficult. Daniel looked down at the table. But I proved them wrong, I continued. Just like I proved something else today. Robert raised his eyes slightly. What's that? That experience is never a weakness. The lesson was simple but powerful. They had believed age meant I was too old to lead. But leadership is not about age. It is about wisdom, courage, and the ability to make difficult decisions when necessary. I picked up my folder and prepared to leave the room. For the first time in many years, I was walking away from Whitmore Industries. Yet I didn't feel regret. Instead, I felt peace. The company had been part of my life for decades, but every story eventually reaches its final chapter. Before leaving, I looked at Daniel one last time. Never underestimate someone who built what you inherited, I said quietly. Then I walked out of the boardroom. Emily was waiting for me in the hallway. She looked curious but hopeful. How did it go? She asked. I smiled gently. Exactly as expected. She laughed softly. I guess they didn't expect you to sell it, . No, I replied. They expected me to accept their decision that I was too old to run the company, . We walked toward the elevator together. As the doors opened, I took one last look down the hallway of the building that had been my second home for 40 years. Sometimes the greatest power is not holding on, but knowing when to let go. And on that quiet next morning, I proved something important: never underestimate a determined woman who knows exactly what she's capable of doing. And if you enjoyed this story about courage, wisdom, and unexpected decisions, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like the video, and share this story with others. Stories like this remind us that experience is powerful, and that respect should never be taken for granted. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because it's always amazing to see how stories connect people from different parts of the world.